We're back, Dr. Elizabeth and me, Rick Chrisman, with another installment of our dialogue about a wonderful book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, former president and CEO of a national think tank called Demos. And now she's a public intellectual and spreading the word of, what is it, Elizabeth? Solidarity dividends in our country. So we'll be unpacking that wonderful phrase. She's a great phrase maker, and she's pointing us in the right direction. But we're going to start, as we do, asking Dr. Elizabeth, what is the meaning of the chapter we're going to discuss, which goes like this: it's never a real never a real democracy. Never a real democracy. What does she mean by that?
Well, this puts us right into the debate that's going on about critical race theory, that's going on with the voter suppression measures we're seeing throughout the country with the recent Supreme Court decision, which Brnovich versus the DNC, as well as Shelby County versus Holder, which got the Voting Rights Act. She starts back at the beginning with the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. Our democracy has historically worked representationally so that you get electoral college votes based on your population. But there was never in the beginning of the country a conversation about whether or not slaves or people who were even free blacks could or should vote. But for counting purposes, for representation, a slave counted for 3/5 of a person. So from the very beginning of the country, the South was weighted more heavily than the North. And that oligarchy of the planter class fuels our history. It leads us from the founding of the country through the expansion of the country and whether new states coming in would be slave or free, and how we would determine how they were slave or free, which led to the Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise, all of which was about trying to even out what states were free and where Black people were not slaves to the places where enslavement was necessary for economic survival, which is, Texas and the more Western states of the South, led to the Civil War. At the end of Reconstruction, it led us to Jim Crow, and it is out of that experience that the Voting Rights Act came into being, as well as the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, which Texas has just decided that they don't need to teach the 15th Amendment or the 19th Amendment, which the 19th giving women the right to vote and the 15th giving persons of color the right to vote.
Wait, let me stop you. I missed something this week, I guess.
Yes.
They don't want, in their schools, they don't want to teach the entire Constitution, including its all.
They're going to skip the 15th and the 19th Amendments.
Well, I am stupefied. I don't know how you can pick and choose. I guess, though, people do it with the Bible, and the Constitution is our national or civic Bible. But that shocks.
It's worse because of the size of Texas and the population of children, students in public school in Texas. National textbooks are written to Texas standards.
Oh,
So this is going to be, you know, it's unbelievable.
right.
It is, as a Christian, I find this offensive. As an American, I find this offensive.
Absolutely.
And that's what she is talking about, that the country was never a real democracy. It was weighted in favor of the slave states, and it's weighted in favor of those same states in the electoral college votes, which is how we get a succession of Republican presidents who win the electoral college vote but don't win the popular vote. It's why we're stuck with the filibuster.
Mhm.
The senators who are from the blue states represent almost 2 to 3 times more people than the senators from the red states.
I want to stop you there and go back to the point about Texas being the state where the textbook publishing is established. I guess it's the national textbook center or headquarters. And so this problem exists not only in their clipping amendments out of the Constitution, but in the way they represent evolution or not, and other subjects. And well, this is a continuing assault on democracy. It never was a real democracy.
Right.
It's not getting there fast.
It isn't. It's actually, I think, worse. Well, Heather McGhee's book is the best book I read this year. The best book I read last year was Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America, which is another book I highly recommend. But she really historically expands the argument that McGhee is making in this chapter. That it was designed as an oligarchy. Even if you were white in the early parts, the early life of the country, you could only vote if you owned property and you were male.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know, as things progressed, again, just like we saw in the chapter with the unions, the fears of poor whites and poor blacks uniting led states to make male white men all eligible to vote.
Well, the worst part of that is that they're doing this through not just technical legislative moves. They're doing it through inhuman methods. I mean, these basic things. I mean, you can't serve water in the line. They're also going to permit partisan poll watchers, and in some states, of course, they carry guns. I mean,
yes, you can use your gun permit in Texas as your voter ID. You cannot use your student ID if you are a college student. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know.
Well, it's it's certainly a discouraging scene, and I don't know what's going to stop the juggernaut, because we know that the Republican legislators in these states are lined up and have been getting lined up for the last 20 years to do this. Unbeknownst to me, I guess I was pretty asleep. But it's also the popular support that they get, which astonishes me. The Republicans are not a majority in the country, but they garner all the people that support this kind of restrictive voting protocols, and they're Christians, or so-called, and I want to know, I want to know what white Christian nationalism has to do with Jesus, and I don't know who to ask that question of.
I saw a post on Facebook yesterday an image of a billboard said Genesis 1:1, one nation under God. That isn't how the
No.
Bible begins. That isn't how this unhealthy civic religious mix is such a problem. I mean, in my view, as a practicing Christian, the nationalism and the white supremacy of the evangelical churches is not Christian.
No, and I need to think of another minute about that. Genesis 1:1. Obviously, they're not only clipping out of the Constitution, they're editing and misrepresenting Scripture. Where was that billboard again? Not in Massachusetts. You saw?
No, it was. I'd have to look again, but it was like, I think, in Arkansas. Or
it was online. I see.
Yeah, and it's, these are the only social media I really follow is Twitter, and there's just so much there that shows not only a misunderstanding of the history of the country, but an abuse and misuse of Scripture to justify it.
Well, I want to tie us back to the magic phrase of Heather McGhee's, the solidarity dividend. And I see at the end of the chapter, there's an example from Connecticut, but I don't.
Yes.
How does that go?
Let's see. I have to find it in my notes.
They did.
I mean, she goes through a lot of things in this chapter that are really important to read about. She not only talks about the voter suppression laws. I think one of the points that, while I sort of knew it, I didn't put it together with this, but the whole system of mass incarceration, which disenfranchises folks with felony convictions. And even, Florida passed a ballot, on a ballot initiative petition that felons, once they've done their time, they should be able to resume their rights as citizens, including the right to vote. And, the Republican legislature essentially created a poll tax for that. You can't vote if you haven't paid your fees, your fines, your whatevers, but there's no place in Texas to go, or I'm sorry, in Florida to go to find out what you owe. So they've still managed to keep, folks who have served their time off the voting rolls. And we know that with the level of mass incarceration, the people that affects the most are people of color. Well, it's just disgusting.
So we, again, are cutting off our nose to spite our face because reversing these rules or taking an alternative path to them would benefit whites. I mean, there are white prisoners. In fact, they are, ex-prisoners, and they are subject to these same restrictions. So it's really great what Heather McGhee has done in this book, which is simply to say, your racist, anti-Black legislation has a corresponding mirror effect on white population. And yet, as we have observed before, the white population a lot of times votes against its own interests. That has to be among the great civic mysteries of all time.
Well, and that's how we get to the solidarity dividend in Connecticut.
Right.
As a result of the Citizens United decisions and the practically unlimited amount of money that can be donated, the Connecticut legislature um, funded public support for local elections to their, not just within cities and towns, but to the state legislature. And they were able, people who were not able to run for office because they could not come up with the money were funded. And it made a huge difference. She writes, Connecticut's solidarity dividend was almost immediate. In the first legislative cycles after public financing, the more diverse by gender, race, and class legislature passed a raft of popular public interest bills, including a guarantee of paid sick days for workers, a minimum wage increase, a state earned income tax credit, in-state tuition for undocumented students. So being able to have funding at the local level for folks who represented a variety of different public interests, be they gender issues or class issues or race issues, were able to come together and have enough financing to be able to become elected. And that changed the makeup of the legislature. It made the representatives and senators at the state level much more responsive to their citizens, to the people who are actually affected by what's happening in our streets and in our schools and in our libraries and all those kinds of things. And it really challenged the people who just wanted to buy a senator or a representative. It was much more, it is much more of a representative democracy in Connecticut.
Well, yes, it's called the Citizens Election Program that you're referring to, that Ms. grants in, and it occurred to me that there was an additional dividend, a civic dividend in that it not only funded candidates who didn't have the tons of cash to spend on a campaign, it also obviated the need to go out and raise it. And this is something that all legislators spend too much time on. I mean, I remember I don't know, some documentary on the subject of what they have to do to earn enough campaign money in terms of the proportion of the time. So that has a lot of payoff.
Well, she quotes one of the, where I gotta find it. She talks about one of the senators, Senator Winfield, who's the state senator. You know, the bigger organizations that privately fund candidates complained that the legislature was using public money for people to run for elections. And Senator Winfield says, yeah, we're using the public's money, but it's the public's government. And if you want it to remain the public's government, you might have to use public money. Otherwise, you're going to have government by the few who have been paying for the government.
Well, listen, Elizabeth, we've outrun our.
I know, we always do. I go on.
No, we could go on a long time. I just want to say, ask, what did we learn that we didn't know before? And for me, it wasn't in the book. It was this thing about clipping out 2 amendments from the Constitution in Texas. Oh my gosh. What's your learning quickly?
Well, this is the chapter where you really see that mouthful of a phrase, a multicultural, anti-racism, pro-democracy, majoritarian movement which is what she has been, this chapter really crystallizes the view of that vision of democracy.
Well, listen, we got to get on the bandwagon, and everybody else too. With that, we'll invite people back to another dialogue next week on the next chapter. In the meantime, be good, be well, and be safe. And that's for you too, Dr. Elizabeth.
You as well. Traveling mercies.
Thank you. Bye now.
Blessings all.
Bye.